Welcome to the Nightmare Vault. Turn off the lights, turn up the volume, and listen closely. Before you close your eyes, drop a hello in the comments and let us know where you're listening from. And if you haven't yet, please like and subscribe. Let's begin. I don't usually tell this story. It's not even the most dramatic thing you'll ever hear. But every time I think about it, even years later, it leaves me with this sick, weightless feeling in my chest, like the moment you miss a step on the stairs. It was late, maybe 11:30, and I had the house to myself. My parents were at a wedding for the weekend, and I was making the most of it, just sprawled on the sofa watching some random crap on YouTube. I remember I had the back door open earlier because it was one of those muggy summer nights, the kind where the air feels thick, even with all the windows cracked. I walked over, shut it properly, double-checked the lock, then stood there for longer than I probably needed to, just staring into the garden. It was pitch black beyond the patio light, just the outline of the fence and a few shapes that could have been anything from garden chairs to shadows. I didn't see anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. I'm not the paranoid type. Or at least I wasn't back then. I remember telling myself the latch must not have caught properly. Maybe the wind shifted it. Stupid little things you tell yourself because the alternative, that someone might have actually touched that door, felt too ridiculous to take seriously. I went back to the sofa, but I couldn't focus. Every little noise outside felt louder, like the creak of the fence or the rustle of leaves. It was just me in that house, and it felt a hell of a lot bigger all of a sudden. About 20 minutes later, I got up to check the door again. This time, the latch was off. There was this stretch of silence. I don't know how long it lasted, and then I heard it. Soft, deliberate tapping, fingertips against glass. Not knocking, not banging, just the tips of fingers, gently tapping the patio door. I didn't move at first. I couldn't. I just stood there, staring down the hall, waiting for something to make it make sense. But it didn't. When I finally moved, it was slow. I kept my feet quiet, like somehow that would make me invisible, and crept towards the back of the house. The tapping had stopped, but my ears were ringing so loud I couldn't tell if there was anything else. I stood there, half hidden behind the kitchen doorway, looking through the gap where the hall met the conservatory, and there, half crouched outside the glass, was a man. I couldn't see his face. He was just a dark shape against the night, but I could see the curve of his back, the way he leaned in close, like he was trying to see through the gap in the curtain. My first thought was to turn off the lights, but then I realized it was too late for that. He already knew I was home. He'd been watching me. I can't even explain what it felt like in that moment, like my body didn't know whether to run, hide, scream, or all three at once. I backed away, slow enough that my socks didn't make a sound against the floor, then bolted upstairs the second I was out of sight. I locked myself in my room, phone shaking in my hand while I called the police. I couldn't even get the words out properly at first. I just kept saying there was someone outside, someone at the door. By the time they got there, he was gone. They found muddy footprints leading up to the patio, clear as day. They said it was probably just a chancer, someone checking doors to see if anyone left them unlocked. But that tapping, that wasn't someone testing locks. That was someone trying to get my attention. I stayed at a mate's house for the rest of the weekend. Even now, I can't sit with my back to a window at night. Sometimes, when I'm half asleep, I swear I hear it again, just the faintest sound, fingertips on glass. And I still don't know if he was just some random creep, or if he knew I was alone the whole time. I used to think moving to the countryside would be peaceful. That was the whole point. Getting out of the city, slowing down a bit, breathing quieter air. I lasted 6 months before I put the place up for sale, and I still won't go back. The house itself was fine. Old stone cottage, the kind you see on postcards, with that low, sloping roof and windows that never quite shut properly. It sat at the end of a long dirt track. Nothing around it but fields and hedgerows. No neighbours, no passing traffic. If you didn't know it was there, you'd never find it. That was the appeal at first. After years of living in flats where you could hear every argument, every scrape of furniture through paper-thin walls, the silence felt like a luxury, at least for a while. The night I'm talking about was early October. I remember that because the heating had packed in the day before, and the whole house felt damp. I was half wrapped in a blanket, sitting on the sofa with my laptop, pretending I wasn't freezing. At some point, I noticed the Wi-Fi was acting up, pages taking ages to load. The little spinning wheel stuck for so long I gave up. I wasn't doing anything important, so I shut the laptop and put the telly on instead. It was quiet enough outside that I could hear the slight hum from the fridge in the kitchen. It's strange, the things you notice when there's no background noise to drown them out. About an hour later, I got up to make a tea and realized the kitchen window was open. Not wide, just a crack. But I hadn't opened it. I was sure of that. It had one of those stiff old latches you had to really force. And I definitely hadn't bothered. I stood there for a while, just staring at it, trying to decide if I was being dramatic. Maybe I'd opened it earlier without thinking. I'd been in and out of the kitchen all day, and the house always felt stuffy. It was possible. I pushed it shut, locked it, and went back to the sofa. I even laughed at myself a bit, the way you do when you feel stupid for overreacting. That was the first mistake, brushing it off. The second was assuming whoever had opened that window was outside. It must have been close to midnight when I started hearing noises from upstairs. Light, careful creaks, like someone shifting their weight on old floorboards. The kind of sound you'd usually blame on the house settling. But this house didn't do that. I knew every creak, every draft, every weird noise it made. This was different. I stood at the bottom of the stairs, staring up into the dark, trying to decide if I was hearing things. There was this part of me, the part that had lived alone for years, that automatically started coming up with excuses. A bird on the roof, maybe a branch scraping against the side of the house. It wasn't until I heard the floorboards right above my head that I knew. There was someone upstairs. I couldn't move for a second. It was like my body hadn't caught up with my brain yet, still trying to process it. Like maybe if I stood perfectly still, they wouldn't notice me. That didn't last long. I backed into the kitchen, my hand shaking so badly I nearly knocked the kettle over. The house felt so much smaller suddenly. Every door a potential hiding place, every window a weakness. I could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on me, the kind that makes your own breathing sound too loud. I didn't know what to do. Call the police? Run? I'd left my phone in the living room, and to get to it, I'd have to cross the hall, completely exposed. My heart was hammering so hard, I was convinced they'd hear it. Then I heard something else, not from upstairs this time, from the back of the house, the soft click of a door closing. There was more than one. I crept towards the front door, every step careful, my socks barely whispering against the tiles. I didn't even bother putting shoes on. The only thing I cared about was getting out. I had my hand on the latch when the handle moved. Slow, deliberate. And I realized there was someone on the other side. Not knocking, not kicking the door in. Just standing there, testing the handle, like they were seeing how far they could push before I noticed. I couldn't breathe. There was no way out. The front door was covered, the back was covered, and I couldn't be sure if the upstairs was clear. I backed into the corner of the kitchen, out of sight from the windows, my back pressed so hard against the cold stone wall. It felt like I was trying to disappear into it. I don't know how long I stayed there. Time sort of bent in on itself, every second stretching so thin it felt unreal. The only thing I remember clearly is the sound of footsteps passing the window, slow and heavy, circling the house, again and again. I must have blacked out at some point, or maybe my brain just shut off to protect itself. When I finally looked up, the first light was creeping in through the curtains, and the house was silent. The police didn't find anything. No prints, no sign of forced entry. They said it was probably kids messing around. I don't think kids would have left the locks open like that. I think whoever they were, they wanted me to know they could have come in whenever they wanted, that they'd already been inside, moving around me while I sat there, completely oblivious. I moved out 2 weeks later. Even now, I can't sleep unless every door's locked and bolted. And sometimes, late at night, I'll think I hear it again, the sound of someone testing the handle. I've lived alone for years now, and for the most part, I like it. I've got a decent flat on the 4th floor of a block, just outside the city centre. Nothing fancy, but it's mine. 1 bedroom, small kitchen, open plan living room. Enough space for 1 person without feeling cramped. I mention that because if you live alone, you get used to how your place sounds when it's empty. The hum of the fridge, the faint click of the radiator cooling down, even the way footsteps sound when they're yours and yours alone. You know the rhythm of it, your own personal silence. That's why I noticed something was off that night. It was a Tuesday, I think, definitely midweek. I remember because I'd just got back from work later than usual, too knackered to cook, so I grabbed a microwave meal from the shop downstairs. Nothing special, just something to eat in front of the telly. I'd only been home about half an hour when I started feeling off. Nothing specific at first, just a low, nagging unease, like I'd forgotten something. I remember standing at the kitchen counter, waiting for the microwave to finish, and realizing I hadn't locked the front door. That wasn't unusual. I'd done it loads of times before, but it stuck with me, like I was hyper-aware of how easy it would have been for someone to walk straight in. I locked it, obviously. Double-checked it, actually. But even after that, I couldn't fully relax. I ended up eating on the sofa with the telly on low, barely paying attention to it. The flat felt weirdly still, like the air itself was thicker. I kept glancing at the hallway, expecting, I don't know what, just something. The first proper sign that something was wrong came about an hour later. I was in the bathroom, brushing my teeth, and I heard this faint sound from the bedroom, like fabric shifting, or the softest creak of a floorboard. I froze, toothbrush halfway to my mouth, just listening. There's this thing your brain does, where it immediately starts coming up with harmless explanations. Maybe I hadn't shut the window properly, and the breeze had caught the curtains. Maybe I'd left something hanging over the side of the bed, and it slipped. But none of that felt right. I stood there way longer than necessary, just listening, but there was nothing after that one sound. The flat was quiet again, the kind of quiet that's so perfect, it almost feels deliberate. I went back to the living room, left the bathroom light on, told myself I was just being jumpy for no reason. That's the thing. When you live alone, you're constantly talking yourself down from stuff like that. Every bump or creak gets a rational explanation because the alternative is too unsettling to consider. I was halfway through convincing myself I'd imagined it when I noticed something. The wardrobe door in my bedroom, the one I always leave slightly ajar so it doesn't catch on the carpet, was closed, fully shut. That was the moment something shifted in my head, like my brain couldn't twist its way around it anymore. I knew I hadn't touched it. I didn't go in straight away. I stood in the hallway for ages, just staring at the door, trying to work out how it could have happened. Did I knock it shut by accident? Was there a draft? All these ridiculous theories that felt thin, even as I thought them. The worst part is, even then, I didn't want to believe what my gut was screaming at me. I crept towards the door, heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, and nudged it open. The wardrobe was empty, just clothes and a couple of boxes stacked on the shelf. No one there. I felt stupid, honestly, really embarrassed at how worked up I'd got. I even laughed a bit, this pathetic little nervous chuckle, like I was trying to prove to myself it was all fine. It wasn't. I turned to go back to the living room, and that's when I saw it. The loft hatch in the ceiling, just outside the bedroom door. It was slightly ajar. I don't have a loft, not a proper one anyway, just a cramped crawl space that runs above the ceiling, barely big enough to store anything. I hadn't opened that hatch since I moved in. I stood there, every inch of my skin crawling, staring up at that narrow gap. It was too high to see into, but I could feel it, that sense of being watched, even though there was no visible face, no obvious movement. Just this overwhelming, suffocating awareness that someone was up there. I backed into the living room, locked the bedroom door, like that would do anything, and grabbed my phone. My hands were shaking so badly it took me 3 tries to unlock it. There was no dramatic crash, no chase, no screaming. The flat stayed perfectly, oppressively quiet. I left. I didn't even grab my bag or keys, just bolted down the stairs in my socks and didn't stop running until I was outside. Phone still clutched in my hand like it was some kind of shield. The police came, obviously. They searched the flat, the crawl space, the whole building. They didn't find anyone, but they did find something. A small screwed up bit of plastic in the loft space, like the torn off corner of a sandwich bag. One of the officers said it's common. People living in crawl spaces sometimes wrap their stuff in plastic to keep it dry. People living in crawl spaces. I didn't sleep in that flat again. I moved in with my sister for a bit, while I found somewhere new. Every now and then, I still get this feeling, when I'm in the shower or sitting up late at night. This cold, prickling certainty that someone's watching, not through the window or the door, but from somewhere inside the house, somewhere just out of sight. And the worst part? I still don't know how long he was there before I noticed. A few years ago, I booked a last-minute trip to this cabin in the countryside. I'd been working ridiculous hours, barely sleeping, and just needed a few days on my own to reset. I wasn't looking for anything fancy, just somewhere quiet where I could sleep in, read a bit, and not talk to anyone. The place was basic, one of those self-catering setups where they leave the key in a little lockbox by the door. It was a single-story cabin right at the edge of some woods, about half a mile off a dirt road. No neighbors, no phone signal, and barely any light once the sun went down. It was exactly what I thought I wanted. The first day was fine. I got there mid-afternoon, unpacked, took a walk down the lane, and spent the evening watching stuff I'd downloaded on my tablet. There was no Wi-Fi, which I knew beforehand, but it felt weirdly relaxing, being completely cut off. It was an old door, with one of those stiff, slightly rusted locks that sticks if you don't lift the handle just right. I locked it, gave it a good shake to make sure it was secure, and went to bed. I didn't think much of it. The next morning, I woke up to find the kitchen window was open, just a crack, but enough that the latch hadn't caught. That one made me pause. I hadn't opened any windows the night before, and it wasn't the kind of window you could accidentally leave ajar. I stood there for a bit, trying to come up with a reasonable explanation. Maybe it hadn't shut properly the last time someone stayed. Maybe the wind had worked it loose. It was an old place. Everything creaked and stuck and didn't quite fit right. I closed it, checked the rest of the doors and windows, then headed out for a walk to clear my head. That night, I made sure everything was locked before I went to bed. Checked twice, just to be sure. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a noise. A soft, rhythmic tap, tap, tap from the living room. Not loud, but steady, like something gently knocking against the glass. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself it was nothing. A branch against the window, maybe, except there were no trees close enough to the cabin for that. It stopped after a minute or so, and the silence after was almost worse. That kind of silence, where your own breathing feels too loud. I should have just gone back to sleep, but I couldn't. I got up, crept to the bedroom door, and stood there listening. Nothing. Just the low hum of the fridge and the faint tick of the clock on the wall. I walked through the cabin, turning on lights as I went, trying to convince myself everything was fine. And it was. All the doors were still locked. All the windows were shut. Nothing was out of place. I went back to bed, and eventually, I must have fallen asleep. The next morning, I found fresh footprints in the dirt outside the back door. They were clear, one set, slightly larger than mine, leading from the tree line to the decking and back again. Whoever it was, they'd come right up to the door. I tried to tell myself it was a walker or a local farmer, even though I knew how ridiculous that sounded. I thought about leaving that day. Honestly, I should have. But it felt embarrassing, cutting the trip short, just because someone passed by. I told myself I'd stay one more night and head home first thing. I didn't get up straight away. I lay there, staring at the door, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my ears. Then I heard the handle. It didn't rattle or shake, just a slow, gentle press. Someone testing it, seeing if I'd forgotten to lock it again. I remember lying there, frozen, thinking maybe if I stayed completely still, they'd think the cabin was empty and move on. But they didn't. I crept out of bed, moving as quietly as I could, and grabbed my phone. No signal, not even a single bar. I stood there in the dark, listening to the soft scrape of metal against wood, wondering how long they'd been out there. If they'd been watching me during the day, or just moving around the cabin at night. I stayed awake until the first light came through the windows. As soon as it was bright enough, I packed up and left. I didn't bother leaving a review or asking for a refund. I just wanted to get as far from that place as possible. The weirdest part was, when I checked the back door before leaving, the lock was undone. It didn't make sense. I know I locked it. I remember testing it, shaking the handle to make sure it was secure. There were no signs of forced entry, no damage, just the unlocked door and a single dirty fingerprint smudged against the glass. I don't know who it was or what they wanted, and to be honest, I don't want to know. I lived in a fairly quiet part of town back then, one of those little developments they build in the early 2000s, all identical townhouses with tiny front gardens and nowhere to park. It was a nice enough area though. Families, older couples, the sort of place where people put up bunting for the Jubilee and wheel their bins out at the exact same time every week. I wasn't used to weird stuff happening there. It was a Thursday, middle of the afternoon, and I was working from home, back when I still had that data entry job. Most of my day was just spreadsheets and emails, so I kept the patio door open for some air. My desk was right by the window, facing the street, so I saw everyone coming and going. I wasn't staring or anything. I just clocked it in that passive way you do when you're half watching the world outside your window. Eventually, a bloke got out. High-vis jacket, clipboard, the whole thing. Looked like every delivery driver or utilities guy I'd ever seen. He didn't go to the house across the road though. He came straight to mine. I didn't think much of it at first. If you've ever lived in a new build estate, you'll know. They're constantly finding excuses to dig up pavements or check water meters or whatever. He knocked, and without really thinking, I opened the door. I've replayed it so many times. How nothing about him seemed off at first. He was polite, said he needed to check something with the gas line. I remember thinking it was a bit weird, because I hadn't had any letters about work being done, but I brushed it off. He didn't come inside straight away. He stood on the doorstep, asking questions about when the house was built, whether I'd noticed any smells or pressure issues. It all sounded plausible enough. But the longer he stood there, the more I started to feel off. There was something about the way he kept glancing past me, like he was trying to see further inside. That's when I lied, said I was just renting and didn't know much about the place. I don't know why I said it, but I'm glad I did, because something changed in his face. Not much, just a flicker, but enough that I noticed. He said he'd need to check the meter, and this is the part where I still kick myself. I let him in. The gas meter was in a cupboard under the stairs, so I led him down the hall. The whole time, I was trying to convince myself I was being weird, that I'd watched too many crime documentaries or read too many horror stories online. But my stomach was tight, and the hairs on my neck hadn't gone down since the moment I opened the door. He crouched to look at the meter, and I stood there, not really sure what to do with myself. Normally you'd leave someone to it, but I didn't want to turn my back on him. Then I saw it, his jacket, the logo on it. It wasn't a gas company. It was some generic courier service I recognized from missed parcel slips. He wasn't there to check anything. I mumbled some excuse about needing to take a call and stepped back into the kitchen, keeping the counter between us. My heart was pounding so hard it made me lightheaded. He stood there for a few seconds, then nodded, said he'd finished, and walked himself out. I locked the door the second he stepped outside. I watched through the window as he walked back to the van, no clipboard, no tools, and drove off without stopping at any other houses. But later that night, I went to close the patio door and noticed the lock was off. Not open, just unlocked. I know I locked it. I'd been in and out earlier, and I always double-check. It's a habit. I barely slept that night. Every noise, every creak, I was convinced he'd come back. I didn't know what he was planning, but it was obvious. Whatever it was, the gas story was just to get through the door. Nothing happened after that. No break-in, no damage, No sign anyone had been inside. But I couldn't shake the feeling that if I hadn't lied about being a renter, if I'd let him think I actually owned the place and knew all the details, maybe I wouldn't have noticed anything was off until it was too late. I never saw the van again. I reported it to the local council and the gas company, just in case. But no one had any record of scheduled checks in the area. To this day, I don't know if he was planning to rob the place or if it was something worse. But I do know one thing. He wasn't a gas worker. And the only reason I'm telling this story is so, if someone ever knocks on your door wearing a high-vis and holding a clipboard, you remember to check twice before you let them in. I booked the place because it was cheap. That was the first mistake. It was one of those small, converted barns listed on Airbnb, way out in the countryside. Looked nice in the pictures. Open-plan living room, modern kitchen, big windows overlooking the fields. The host had one of those overly friendly bios, the sort that goes on about loving nature and welcoming all guests like family. I skimmed past it. I just wanted somewhere quiet for the weekend, somewhere I could turn my phone off and not think about work. The drive up was long, all narrow roads and barely any phone signal. The nearest village was about 5 miles back, just a pub, a post office, and a co-op. By the time I pulled into the driveway, it was already getting dark. The barn was tucked behind a line of trees, with a gravel path leading up to the door. There wasn't another house in sight. At first it was fine, a bit cold inside, but clean enough. One big room downstairs, kitchen, living area, dining table, and a staircase leading up to a mezzanine bedroom. The windows were huge, stretching almost floor to ceiling. And even though the view was nice during the day, I remember thinking I'd probably keep the curtains shut at night. It felt too exposed. I don't even remember why I noticed the first one. I think I was looking for a plug socket near the TV. There was this tiny hole in the skirting board, just next to the media unit, barely bigger than a pea, but it looked too precise to be random damage. I probably wouldn't have thought anything of it if I hadn't seen the lens. It was so small I almost missed it, but once I spotted it, there was no mistaking it. A tiny black circle tucked deep inside the hole. A camera. I sat there for a minute, just staring at it, trying to convince myself it wasn't what I thought. Maybe it was an old sensor, or part of the heating system. Something innocent, but the longer I stared, the more certain I was. It was a camera. That's when the second mistake happened. I didn't leave, but after that, I couldn't relax. One in the kitchen, tucked inside a vent cover. One near the stairs, facing the front door. And one in the bedroom, high up in the beam above the bed. That was the one that made me feel sick. I don't know how long I sat on the edge of the bed, trying to decide what to do. It was late by then, properly dark outside, and the thought of driving back down those pitch-black roads wasn't exactly appealing. The rational part of my brain kept trying to downplay it. Maybe the owner used them for security, or they were from before the renovation and never removed. I took some photos, emailed them to Airbnb, then shut all the curtains and tried to sleep. I kept telling myself I was overreacting, that no one was actually watching me. The cameras were probably disconnected. I crept halfway down the stairs, just enough to see the kitchen, and the door was standing open, wide open, letting in the cold air from outside. I knew I'd locked it. I was obsessive about checking after I found the cameras, but there it was, swinging slightly on its hinges, like someone had just stepped through. That's when I finally accepted I wasn't alone. I didn't hear anyone, didn't see any movement, but the silence felt heavier somehow, like the house itself was holding its breath. I went back upstairs, locked the bedroom door, and barricaded it with the wardrobe. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone. No service, no Wi-Fi either. The listing had made a big deal about the place being a digital detox retreat. I sat on the floor with my back to the wall, phone clutched in both hands, trying to figure out what to do. I couldn't call anyone, couldn't leave without walking straight past that open door. I felt completely trapped. At some point, I must have dozed off. Not proper sleep, just that awful, fitful half-sleep where your brain refuses to switch off. I woke up to the sound of footsteps on the stairs. Slow, deliberate steps, not even trying to be quiet. They stopped just outside the bedroom door. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. The handle turned, not rattling, not forcing, just a gentle testing twist. When it didn't open, they stood there for a while. I could hear their breathing through the crack under the door. Eventually, the footsteps moved away, back down the stairs. I waited until the first light crept through the curtains before I opened the door. The back door was shut again, locked this time. No sign anyone had been there, no muddy footprints, nothing out of place. But when I checked my phone, the photos I'd taken of the cameras were gone. I didn't stay for the second night. I never got a proper response from Airbnb either, just some generic message about looking into it. The listing disappeared a few days later. No explanation. I still think about it sometimes, especially when I'm staying somewhere unfamiliar. Not the cameras though, not even the person at the door. It's the fact they took the time to go through my phone, to delete the evidence, while I was asleep, just a few feet away. My parents used to go away a lot when I was a teenager. Weekend trips, little getaways whenever they could. I liked having the house to myself back then. It felt like a small taste of being independent without actually moving out. The first few hours always felt like freedom. The house wasn't huge, just a pretty standard, detached place in a quiet cul-de-sac. Close enough to hear the neighbors cutting their grass, but far enough that you could scream into a pillow and no one would notice. It always felt safe, probably because I'd lived there my whole life. The night I'm talking about, they'd left that afternoon. Some anniversary weekend or something like that. I wasn't planning anything wild. I ordered a pizza, played some Xbox, the usual. Around 10, I went around locking up. Back door, patio door, front door, all the usual checks. I'd done it 100 times before. Except I forgot the small window in the downstairs toilet. I still remember standing in the hallway after doing my little security sweep, feeling oddly proud of myself for being responsible. It's such a stupid memory, but it sticks because of how wrong I was. I stayed up till about 1. Nothing unusual, just scrolling on my phone in bed, drifting in and out. The house felt normal, quiet, a bit creaky because of the heating pipes, but normal. At some point, I heard this noise downstairs. Not loud, just a soft shifting sound, like fabric brushing against something. I sat up, trying to work out if it was real or just one of those half-dream sounds you get when you're dozing off. I convinced myself it was the fridge, or the house settling, or maybe the cat from next door outside the window. All the usual excuses. But after a minute, I realized I wasn't drifting off anymore. I was awake, fully awake, sitting in the dark, just listening. It was quiet again. I was about to lie back down when I heard it, the faintest creak of a floorboard. It came from the bottom of the stairs. I froze, properly froze, like my body didn't know what to do. It was the kind of sound you only notice when the house is completely silent. the slight shift of weight on old wood. I told myself I was imagining it, even though I knew every floorboard in that house. I knew exactly which one squeaked when you stepped too close to the wall. This was that one. I climbed out of bed as quietly as I could and opened my door just a crack. The landing was dark, and I couldn't see the bottom of the stairs from my angle. I stood there for ages, just listening. Nothing. It was probably nothing. That's what I told myself. I went back to bed, but I didn't lie down. I just sat there, phone in my hand, blanket pulled up like that would do anything. My heart was racing, but the house stayed quiet. No more creaks, no footsteps. Eventually, I calmed down enough to think I was being ridiculous. If someone had broken in, I would have heard more, wouldn't I? Glass breaking, a door opening, something. I told myself the fridge had made the noise, and the floorboard creak was just the house settling. That made sense. I was tired, wired from too much screen time, letting my brain fill in gaps that weren't there. I was almost back to normal when I heard the scrape. Not loud, just the soft drag of something across the kitchen floor. I knew then. I knew someone was inside the house. I didn't want to believe it. My brain kept throwing out excuses, like maybe something fell off the counter, or the pizza box shifted. But my gut knew. I could feel it, that horrible, stomach-dropping certainty. I slid off the bed and crept towards the landing. The stairs were still dark, but from the top step, I could just see a sliver of the hallway below. The kitchen door was slightly open, and through the gap, I could see movement. The faintest shift of a shadow, too smooth and deliberate to be anything accidental. I stepped back so fast I nearly tripped over my own feet. My brain was screaming at me to call the police, but my phone was in my hand, shaking so badly I could barely unlock it. My breathing was too loud, and I couldn't stop imagining whoever was down there hearing it. I backed into my room, locked the door, and pressed myself against the wall, just listening. The scrape came again, followed by a soft metallic clink. The cutlery drawer. They were looking through the kitchen drawers, slowly, quietly, like they had all the time in the world. I kept thinking, why didn't they just kick the door in if they wanted to rob the place? Why come in so quietly, moving so slowly? That was the worst part, knowing they weren't there to steal the telly or grab my laptop. Whoever they were, they came in quiet because they knew someone was home, and they didn't care. I sat there, phone clutched so tight my hand hurt, barely breathing. I don't know how long I stayed like that. Maybe 20 minutes, maybe an hour. Eventually, the noises stopped. No footsteps leaving, no door closing, just silence. I didn't move until the sky started getting light. When I finally worked up the nerve to check, the kitchen was empty. The back door was locked, but the small window in the downstairs toilet, the one I forgot to check, was wide open. The police didn't find anything. No footprints, no signs of forced entry, nothing missing. They said it was probably a one-off. Maybe someone saw the empty driveway and thought the house was empty. But I can't stop thinking about how quiet they were, how carefully they moved. Like they'd been watching the house for a while, maybe even knew my parents were away. And the only reason I'm telling this now is because I still think about it every time I go back there. How it wasn't some big, dramatic break-in, just a small mistake, one unlocked window that let someone inside. I bought the house because it was cheap. That's how these stories always start, isn't it? Some too-good-to-be-true deal on a place that just needs a little work. It was a detached Victorian house at the end of a quiet street, the kind of place estate agents call full of character to to distract from the fact it needs rewiring and probably has asbestos somewhere. The garden was overgrown, the windows needed replacing, but it had potential. That's what I told myself. The first few weeks were fine. I wasn't living there yet, just coming by in the evenings and weekends to do what I could before hiring proper builders. Stripping wallpaper, cleaning, fixing little things. It was slow going, but I liked it. There was something satisfying about turning a run-down place into something livable. At least, that's how I felt until I found the first cigarette butt. It was on the windowsill outside the kitchen, half-smoked, lipstick smudged on the filter. I don't smoke. None of my mates do either. I almost convinced myself it had been there for years, maybe fallen out of some old guttering. Then I found another. This one in the back garden, fresh enough that the smell still clung to it. It was strange, but I didn't think much of it. The house had been empty for years before I bought it. Maybe someone had been using the garden as a shortcut. It wasn't fenced off properly, and there was an alley running behind it. That's what I told myself anyway. I started noticing other things too, little signs that someone had been around when I wasn't there. The side gate, which I always shut, would be slightly open. Dusty footprints in the hallway, even though I always took my boots off at the door. Once, I found an old beer bottle on the stairs. I told myself it was kids. Maybe locals who used to mess around in the place before it was sold. It made sense, didn't it? Then I found the note. It was wedged in the front door, folded into a tight square. Just 2 words, written in messy, scrawled handwriting. Nice place. I remember standing there, holding it, feeling the first real pang of unease. Up until that point, it had been easy to brush things off, but this was different. This was deliberate. I checked every room that night, went through the whole house, top to bottom, making sure no one was inside. I didn't find anything. No open windows, no signs of forced entry. Just an empty house that suddenly felt a lot less like mine. I thought about calling the police, but what would I even say? Someone left a creepy note. It wasn't a crime to loiter, and technically, I couldn't prove anything had actually been stolen. So I let it go. That was my mistake. About a week later, I decided to stay overnight for the first time. The place was still barely livable. No central heating, bare floorboards, a mattress on the floor. But I wanted to get a proper feel for the house. It was fine at first. Quiet. A bit eerie, but that was expected in an empty house. I left a lamp on in the hallway, just enough light to make the place feel less abandoned. I woke up at 3:27 a.m. to the sound of footsteps downstairs. Not a creak, not a distant noise I could have imagined. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving across the wooden floorboards. I didn't move at first. I just lay there, listening, heart pounding so hard it made my hands shake. There was no reason anyone should be there, no reason at all. The steps stopped at the bottom of the stairs. That's when I realized 2 things almost at the same time. The front door was still locked. Whoever was inside had gotten in some other way. I stayed completely still, barely breathing, waiting for the next noise. Nothing. I don't know how long I lay there, staring at the open doorway of my room, expecting to see someone step through. It felt like forever, but eventually the silence stretched out long enough that doubt started creeping in. Had I imagined it? Maybe I'd dreamt it, half waking and disoriented. The silence didn't feel right though. It was too thick, too intentional. I sat up as quietly as I could, straining to hear anything. Breathing, movement, anything. Then I heard it, not from downstairs this time, from the hallway, just outside my door. A single, quiet exhale. I didn't think, I just acted. I grabbed my phone, turned the torch on, and lunged for the door in one movement, slamming it shut and shoving my weight against it. My fingers fumbled for the lock. Thank God I'd thought to install one, and I turned it just as the handle twitched. Not rattled, not yanked, just tested, like they were seeing if I'd locked it. I called the police. My voice was shaking so much I could barely get the words out. I told them someone was in my house, that I was locked in my bedroom. They told me to stay on the line. I stood there, pressed against the door, waiting for the inevitable. Footsteps retreating, the sound of someone running. But there was nothing, just silence. The police arrived in under 10 minutes. They found the back door wide open, the old lock barely hanging onto the frame. They searched the whole house, the alley behind it, even knocked on a few doors up the street. They didn't find anyone, but they did find something else. In the overgrown grass behind the shed, there was a pile of cigarette butts, and beside them, flattened into the dirt, 2 deep imprints, like someone had been crouching there for a long time, watching the house, watching me. The police said it was probably a squatter, someone who'd been using the place before I moved in. They took a statement, told me to get better locks, and left. That was it. I changed the locks the next day, put up security cameras, slept with a hammer by the bed for weeks. Nothing else happened after that. No more footprints, no more notes, no more cigarette butts. But I still think about it sometimes. How long had he been watching me before I noticed? And if I hadn't woken up that night, would I have ever noticed at all? When I was about 15, I stayed over at my friend Callum's house one weekend. We'd been mates for years, spent most of our time at each other's places, so his house felt almost as familiar as my own. It was a pretty normal, semi-detached, the kind you see in every suburban estate. Narrow hallway, stairs right by the front door, living room off to the side, kitchen at the back. His parents were always nice, the type that didn't mind a bit of noise as long as we didn't break anything. That night, it was just me, Callum, and his little brother Jamie. Their parents had gone out for dinner, said they'd be back late. Nothing unusual. They trusted us not to burn the house down. We spent the first half of the evening in the living room, watching some terrible action film and eating our body weight in crisps. Around 11, Jamie went up to bed, leaving me and Callum to keep watching rubbish on TV until we couldn't keep our eyes open. At some point after midnight, we crashed out in the living room, me on the sofa, Callum on a pile of cushions on the floor. I woke up sometime later. No idea what time it was, but the room was dark. The TV just a faint blue glow in the corner. It took me a second to remember where I was. Then I heard footsteps on the stairs. Slow, steady steps. Not loud, but deliberate. At first, I thought it was Callum's parents getting home. I half sat up, expecting to hear the front door, or maybe the sound of keys. But the house stayed completely silent apart from the footsteps. They weren't coming from outside. They were inside the house. I figured it was Jamie. Maybe he'd woken up for the toilet or a drink. It made sense, so I lay back down, not thinking much of it. But then the footsteps stopped. Not at the top of the stairs, where the bathroom was. Right near the middle, the part of the staircase that overlooked the living room. I turned my head, expecting to see Jamie standing there, but I couldn't make out much. Just the faintest silhouette. Someone standing perfectly still on the stairs. I remember thinking how weird it was. Jamie was only about 10, and if he'd woken up, he'd normally either call for Callum or just charge straight past. He wouldn't stand there, just watching. Still, I didn't think much of it. I was half asleep, and it was probably just one of those weird middle-of-the-night moments where everything feels off. The silhouette eventually moved back up the stairs, and I must have dozed off again because the next thing I remember was waking up to sunlight coming through the window. At breakfast, I mentioned Jamie coming downstairs, just offhand, more as conversation than anything. Callum gave me this confused look. Jamie hadn't come downstairs. In fact, Jamie hadn't left his room all night. That was the first time I felt properly unsettled. But still, I figured maybe Callum's parents had come home while we were asleep, wandered around a bit, and gone to bed. It wasn't until later that afternoon, when Callum's parents actually did come home, that it clicked. They'd been out all night, stayed at a mate's after the dinner, only got back just before lunch. So whoever I saw on the stairs, it wasn't them. I told Callum, half joking, expecting him to laugh or call me an idiot. Instead, he just went quiet. He told me something I hadn't known. About a week earlier, they'd found the back gate wide open in the morning. Nothing missing, no sign anyone had actually been inside the house. So they'd assumed it was the wind, or maybe the neighbor's kid cutting through. But after I told him what I saw, we went around checking every door and window, just in case. That's when we found the bathroom window, the small one above the sink, unlocked. Neither of us remembered opening it. Nothing was taken. There was no sign anyone had broken in. But the more we thought about it, the more it made sense. If someone had come in, they didn't care about stealing anything. They just stood on the stairs, watching us sleep. The police didn't do much. They took a statement, had a quick look around, said it was probably a one-off, maybe someone checking for empty houses. I never stayed over at Callum's again. Even now, when I wake up in the middle of the night, sometimes I'll lie there in the dark, listening, remembering those footsteps on the stairs. And I always wonder, if I hadn't woken up, would they have just stood there all night? Or would they have come closer? I've always liked living high up. Something about being on the top floor made me feel a bit safer, like there was this extra layer between me and whatever could go wrong outside. No one could just wander past your window. No unexpected knocks at the back door. My last flat was on the top floor of this converted building. Used to be some office block or something. Split into a few flats after the company went under. It wasn't anything fancy. Plain walls, cheap flooring. But it was affordable and had a decent view over the park. The only thing I didn't love was the fire escape. It ran right up the side of the building, a metal staircase bolted onto the wall, ending at my kitchen window. Most of the time, I forgot it was even there, but every now and then, I'd catch myself glancing out at it, thinking how easy it would be for someone to climb up if they wanted to. It wasn't like it was hidden. You could see it from the street. Anyone could. I lived there for about a year without any issues. The building was quiet. The other tenants kept to themselves, and I got comfortable. I mean properly comfortable. Sometimes leaving the kitchen window cracked at night for fresh air, even though it opened straight onto the fire escape. I know. This one night, I was sitting in the living room watching some documentary, one of those true crime things where they drag every tiny detail out. The whole flat was dark apart from the TV and this little lamp next to the sofa. It felt cozy, that kind of quiet you only get living alone, when the only sounds are the ones you make. Somewhere around midnight, I got up to grab a drink. The kitchen light was off, and as I walked in, I noticed the window was open a bit wider than I remembered leaving it. I stood there for a second, just looking at it, trying to work out if I'd opened it that wide, or if maybe the wind had caught it. It didn't feel right, but I didn't want to overthink it. I pushed it shut, locked it, and went back to the sofa. It bugged me though, not enough to make me panic, just this low-level irritation, like I was annoyed with myself for being careless. About half an hour later, I heard this soft scrape. It wasn't loud, barely more than a whisper, but it was enough to cut through the sound of the TV. It came from the kitchen. I muted the TV and sat there, holding my breath, waiting to hear it again. Nothing. I tried to shake it off, told myself it was just the building settling. I'd heard it creak loads of times before, but after a few minutes, I couldn't ignore the feeling. That itch in the back of your mind when you know something isn't right. I got up and walked back into the kitchen, flicking the light on as I went. The window was shut, still locked, but there was something off about the latch. It was turned just slightly, like someone had tried it from the outside. I stood there for a good minute, just staring at it, trying to talk myself out of what I already knew. The thing is, there's only one way to reach that window, the fire escape. I leaned towards the glass, trying to see down the metal stairs, but the angle was all wrong. I couldn't see much past the platform outside my window. Everything below that was just dark, empty space. I told myself to stop being stupid. It was late, I was tired, and the fire escape had always made me a bit twitchy. I locked the window again, properly this time, and went to bed. I woke up at 3:42. I remember the exact time because I checked my phone the second I opened my eyes. Something had woken me, that much I was sure of. But the flat was completely silent. Then I heard it. Soft footsteps, just outside my bedroom door. The floor in that flat was cheap laminate, the kind that shifts under weight, and every step made this faint, sticky sound, like someone lifting their shoe off the floor a bit too slowly. I lay there, absolutely still, listening as whoever it was moved down the hall. Not fast, not trying to be quiet, just slow and deliberate. Like they knew I was awake and were waiting to see what I'd do. My bedroom door didn't have a lock. There wasn't even a keyhole, just a plain handle with no way to secure it. I got out of bed as quietly as I could and pressed my weight against it, holding the handle down so it couldn't turn. The footsteps stopped, just outside. For the longest minute of my life, I stood there, my ear against the wood, barely breathing. Then, slowly, the footsteps moved back down the hall. I heard the scrape of the kitchen window sliding open. I didn't move until I heard the faint creak of the fire escape outside. I never saw them. I don't know how long they'd been inside before I woke up, or how they got the window open so quietly. The police came, checked the flat, took a statement. They said it was probably someone trying their luck, seeing if anyone left a window unlocked. That's the part I still can't get over. They didn't take anything. My laptop, my phone, all of it was right there in the living room. They didn't even touch it. Whoever it was, they weren't there to rob me. They just walked around my flat, watching me sleep, and left the same way they came in, up the fire escape. I moved out 3 weeks later. This happened about 7 years ago, when I was still living at my parents' place. They'd gone to visit my gran for the weekend. I was supposed to go too, but I'd made some excuse about needing to revise for exams. Truth was, I just wanted the house to myself. It was one of those boring, comfortable suburban areas. Rows of semi-detached houses, every garden separated by the same sagging wooden fences. The kind of place where nothing ever happens unless someone's cat goes missing. That weekend, there was a storm, not just a bit of rain. Proper gale force wind, rain slamming against the windows. The kind of storm where you can't hear yourself think if you're near the conservatory. It started around 6, and by the time it got dark, it was relentless. At first, I didn't mind it. I made some toast, put the Xbox on, and settled in for the night. It felt kind of cozy, being inside while the weather hammered down outside. The first thing I noticed was the back gate. It's one of those tall, heavy wooden gates that sticks if you don't lift it a certain way. It's always been like that. One of those little quirks you get used to after years of living somewhere. Around 9, I heard it slam. Not creak, not swing. Slam. That was the first mistake. It must have been about half an hour later when I heard the first noise from inside the house. It was faint. A soft, rhythmic tap, like something knocking against glass. I muted the TV and listened, half expecting to see rain leaking through a window somewhere. The sound was coming from the kitchen. I walked in, flicked the light on, and stood there for a second, just listening. The window above the sink was rattling slightly, not unusual in a storm, but nothing else seemed off. I locked the back door, just to be safe, checked the window was shut properly, then went back to the living room. I told myself I was just being jumpy. The next noise was louder, a dull thud, like something heavy shifting upstairs. This time, it got under my skin. I stood at the bottom of the stairs, staring up into the dark, trying to work out what could have fallen over. I wasn't messy. There was nothing left lying around upstairs that could have made a noise like that. But again, I rationalized it. Maybe something in the loft shifted, the wind, or the house settling. Old houses make noise, especially in bad weather. That's what I told myself. I went back to the sofa, but I couldn't settle. The storm was so loud by that point, with the wind howling against the windows, that every creak and crack of the house blurred into the background noise. It was impossible to tell what was just the weather and what wasn't. About 20 minutes later, I heard footsteps. Not the clear, sharp kind, just the faintest suggestion of movement somewhere upstairs. Slow, uneven steps, barely audible under the storm. I turned the TV off completely. Just sat there in the silence, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But the longer I listened, the more certain I became that someone, or something, was moving just above me. I grabbed my phone, ready to call my parents or even the police, but I couldn't make myself press dial. It felt ridiculous. I hadn't seen anything, hadn't heard anything clear enough to be sure. What was I going to say? I think I'm imagining someone in the house? That's when I heard the floorboard at the top of the stairs. There's this one board, right near my parents' bedroom, that always creaks if you step on it wrong. Every house has one. You get so used to the sound you don't even think about it. But hearing it when you know you're supposed to be alone, that's different. I didn't move at first. I just sat there, heart pounding, waiting for the next sound. Then the front door rattled, just once. Not a knock, not someone trying to get in. Just the handle, lightly tested, almost like whoever was inside wanted to be sure the door was locked before they went back upstairs. That was when I knew. Someone was already inside. I stood up slowly, trying not to make any noise. I wanted to run, just bolt out the back door and into the storm. But if they were upstairs, I'd have to pass the stairs to get to the kitchen. There was no way to do that quietly. I crept into the hallway, staying close to the wall where the floorboards were quieter, and listened. The house was silent. No footsteps, no creaks, just the endless howling of the storm outside, masking everything else. I made it to the kitchen, unlocked the back door, and slipped outside into the rain. The wind was so strong it nearly knocked me sideways, but I didn't stop. I climbed over the side gate, my hands slipping on the wet wood, and ran to the neighbors, hammering on their door until they answered. The police came, searched the house, found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no muddy footprints, no proof anyone had been there at all. They said the storm had probably made the noises, branches hitting the roof, wind shaking the windows. Maybe I'd worked myself up after being alone all night. I wanted to believe them, but the next day, when I went back to collect some stuff before my parents got home, I noticed something. The upstairs window, the one at the back that opens onto the flat roof above the kitchen, was unlocked, and on the windowsill outside, just visible in the daylight, were 2 wet footprints. This happened back in 2018, when I was house-sitting for my sister and her husband. They lived in one of those new-build gated communities, the kind with identical houses, immaculate little gardens, and a security gate you had to buzz through to get in. It always felt weirdly artificial to me, like living on a film set. But they liked it. They'd gone to Spain for a week, and I offered to look after the house while they were away, mostly to get some peace and quiet after a breakup I was still pretending hadn't bothered me. It felt like the perfect excuse to disappear for a bit, so I moved in for the week. The first couple of days were fine. I worked remotely from the kitchen table, went for a couple of walks around the estate, even chatted with one of the neighbors who was out trimming their hedge. Everyone was polite. In that way, people are, when they don't really want to know you, but feel obligated to smile. It was the 3rd day when I saw him. I was making a coffee when I noticed a bloke in a high-vis vest walking along the side of the house. He wasn't doing anything suspicious, just holding a clipboard, looking at the outside wall, like he was checking something off a list. It didn't even register as weird at first. In a place like that, contractors were always around, cutting grass, fixing pavements, all those little jobs the residents' committee didn't want to do themselves. He caught me watching and gave a polite nod, so I raised my mug in that awkward half-wave people do when they can't be bothered to speak. I assumed he was checking something with the drains or the gas meter, and I got on with my day. It wasn't until I saw him again, about an hour later, that something felt off. This time, he was standing near the back fence, partially obscured by the hedge, not working, not writing anything down, just standing there, staring towards the house. I told myself he was waiting for someone, maybe checking for access points, planning his route. Contractors do that kind of thing, right? But there was something about the way he stood, hands in his pockets, head slightly tilted. That made me feel uneasy. I nearly opened the door to ask if he needed anything, but I didn't. Later that evening, I went out to bring the bins in, and I noticed the side gate was unlatched. It hadn't been like that earlier. I was sure of it. My sister's paranoid about security, and she'd given me a whole speech before she left about keeping everything locked up. I tried to brush it off. Maybe the wind had caught it, or maybe I hadn't shut it properly after taking the bins out. But the doubt was there now, nagging at me. That night, the house felt different. I locked every door, double-checked the windows, even left a couple of lights on. It was ridiculous. I was in a gated community, the safest place you could be, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. At about 1 a.m., I woke up. I wasn't sure what had disturbed me at first. No loud noise, no obvious reason. But the longer I lay there, the more I became aware of it. Footsteps. Soft, deliberate footsteps. Not outside, but inside the house. I froze, barely breathing, trying to convince myself I was hearing things. But they were too clear, too deliberate, moving slowly down the hall towards the kitchen. I grabbed my phone, my hand shaking so much I nearly dropped it, and crept out of bed. The house was dark apart from the glow from the oven clock in the kitchen. The footsteps had stopped, but I could feel it. That horrible, suffocating sense that someone was still there. I stood at the top of the stairs, listening. Nothing. I told myself it could have been the house settling, old pipes, or the heating kicking in. It was easier to believe that than the alternative. I was halfway back to my room when I saw it. The faintest outline of someone standing at the bottom of the stairs. Just standing there, perfectly still. He wasn't wearing the high-vis anymore. I didn't move. Neither did he. I could barely make out his face, just the vague shape of it in the dark. But I knew it was the same man. The man who'd blended in so easily, walking around the estate in broad daylight, like he belonged there. I backed into the bedroom, locked the door, and stood there with my back against it, heart hammering so loud I thought it would give me away. I don't know how long I stood there, but eventually I heard the soft creak of the front door opening. Then silence. The police didn't find anything. No signs of forced entry, no prints, nothing missing. They said it was probably a misunderstanding, a contractor with the wrong house, or a resident's guest who got confused. But the neighbor I'd spoken to on the first day told me something else. There hadn't been any scheduled work that week. No maintenance, no inspections. Whoever he was, he'd never been supposed to be there. And the worst part? When they checked the security footage from the front gate, they couldn't find any record of him ever coming in. This happened in my second year at uni, 2019, I think. I was living in one of the older dorm buildings, the kind with those long, echoey corridors and doors that never quite shut right unless you slammed them. It was a decent enough place. My room was on the top floor, at the far end, tucked away from most of the noise, which I liked. I'd always been the kind of person who felt safe in places like that. Buildings full of students, people constantly coming and going. There was this automatic sense that nothing really could happen. That was probably why I got so lazy with locking my door. I didn't think much of it back then. Everyone propped their doors open when they were hanging out. And most of the time, if I left my door unlocked while I went for a shower or ran down to the kitchen, it was fine. I'd been doing it for months. Nothing ever happened. That night started like any other. I'd had a long day of lectures, so I spent the evening in my room, watching crap on my laptop and eating instant noodles. The hall outside was quiet. Most people either out or in their rooms. I remember feeling kind of smug about how I'd practically perfected my little dorm routine. Everything within reach. Door cracked open for airflow. No worries. It's embarrassing to think about now. At around midnight, I went down to the communal kitchen to make tea. I was gone maybe 5 minutes. Didn't even think to lock the door because, like I said, I'd done it 100 times before. When I got back, nothing looked off. My laptop was still on my bed. My phone was charging. Nothing was missing. I sat down, drank my tea, and didn't give it a second thought. I stayed up a bit longer, scrolling on my phone, then got ready for bed. By about 1:30, I'd turned the lights off and was lying there, half watching some video, just waiting to drift off. That's when I heard it. A faint, soft sound, not from outside the door, inside the room. It was so quiet I almost convinced myself I was imagining it. Just a soft shuffle, like fabric against carpet. I sat up, listening, but it was silent again. I even laughed at myself, thinking maybe my brain was playing tricks because I was tired. My room wasn't big, just a bed, desk, wardrobe, and this little alcove where I kept a pile of laundry. There was nowhere for anyone to hide. That's what I thought. I got up to brush my teeth, still half scolding myself for being jumpy over nothing. When I came back, I swear something felt off. The air just felt heavier, like a room does when someone else has been in it. I stood there for a second, trying to work out if anything had moved. My jacket on the chair, my trainers by the door. But everything looked exactly the same. I locked the door before getting into bed. I remember that part clearly, because I felt a bit ridiculous doing it. I must have fallen asleep for a bit, because the next thing I remember, I woke up needing the toilet. It was about 3 a.m. When I turned over to grab my phone, that's when I saw it. The wardrobe door, the one I always left slightly ajar so it wouldn't stick, was wide open. Not just open, wide open, like someone had pulled it all the way. I froze halfway up, my brain trying to come up with any reason why it could have been me. Maybe I'd brushed against it earlier. Maybe I'd knocked it open when I grabbed a jumper. But I knew. I sat there, heart pounding, staring into the dark gap between my hanging clothes. There was just enough light from the corridor seeping under the door to see the back wall. It was empty, but the space at the bottom, the gap beneath the hanging clothes, was too dark, too full. I don't know how long I sat there, trying to convince myself I was imagining it, telling myself there was no way, absolutely no way, anyone could have been in my room without me noticing. The door had been locked when I woke up. I worked up the nerve to get out of bed, phone torch on, and check. My legs were shaking so badly I could barely stand. There was no one in the wardrobe, but the pile of clothes in the alcove, the one I'd walked past a dozen times that night, was shifted slightly, like something, or someone, had been sitting behind it. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I asked the guys across the hall if anyone had been messing around, pranking people, sneaking into rooms, but no one had. In fact, half the floor had been out at the pub till close, and the others were either asleep or glued to their screens. I tried to forget about it. I even convinced myself it was stress, a weird dream, maybe me half sleepwalking and leaving the wardrobe open myself. I believed that, right up until the next evening, when I found a single empty crisp packet stuffed inside the wardrobe, tucked behind my shoes. It wasn't mine. I don't know how long they'd been in there. Hours, maybe longer, watching me, moving around whenever I left the room. The only thing I do know is that whoever it was, they didn't need to force their way in, because I left the door unlocked for them. This happened in the summer of 2017. I'd just finished college and was skint, so when my uncle offered me his old mobile home to stay in for a few months, rent-free, I said yes without thinking. It wasn't much, just a single wide caravan dumped on a patch of land he used for storage. No proper neighbours, just fields and some overgrown footpaths that led off into nowhere. The nearest village was about 3 miles away, and even that was just a pub, a shop, and a post office. The isolation didn't bother me at first. I actually liked the quiet. No traffic noise, no one stomping around upstairs. It felt peaceful. But that's the problem with places like that. They feel peaceful, right up until the moment they don't. The first time I noticed anything weird was about a week in. I was outside, messing around with the barbecue, when I found footprints near the back of the mobile home. Not mine. They were half sunken into the dry mud, leading from the hedgerow up to the back window. Just a single line of prints, no sign of whoever left them turning around, like they'd walked up, stood there for a while, then wandered off. I told myself they were old, maybe from the last time my uncle came to clear the place out. It made sense at the time. The next night, I heard tapping. It was just past midnight. I was lying in bed with the windows open because it had been stupidly hot all day. I was half asleep when I heard it. Light, irregular taps against the side of the caravan, too soft to be the wind. I sat up, listened for a bit, but it stopped. The thing is, in a place that quiet, you notice everything. Even the creak of the walls shifting at night sounds too loud. I brushed it off, probably a bird or a branch, and went back to sleep. The next day, I found a plastic bottle near the back steps. One of those cheap bottles of water you get in corner shops. It wasn't mine, and it wasn't there the day before. I don't know why it unsettled me so much, but it did. The following night, the tapping came back. Only this time, it wasn't at the side. It was at the window above the sink. I froze, lying there in the dark, trying to convince myself I'd imagined it. But it came again. Light, deliberate taps against the glass. 3, maybe 4. I told myself it was an animal, a fox, a badger, something nosing around. But I didn't sleep after that. By the time the sun came up, I'd almost convinced myself I was overreacting. Almost. That afternoon, I walked the perimeter of the land, not for any real reason, just to settle my nerves. The ground was dry, cracked in places, and about 10 meters from the back door, I found cigarette butts. 3 of them, all stubbed out in a neat little cluster, like someone had been standing there watching the mobile home. That's when I knew. Someone had been out there, more than once, close enough to see through the windows, close enough to hear me moving around inside. I should have left then, packed my stuff, walked the 3 miles to the village, and never looked back. But I didn't. It's embarrassing how easy it is to convince yourself nothing's wrong when you really want to believe that. That night, the last night I stayed there, the rain started around 10, proper heavy, the kind that drowns out every other sound. I remember sitting at the table, watching the water streak down the glass, thinking how glad I was to be inside. I locked the door, shut every window, double-checked the back door for good measure. By midnight, I was in bed, the rain still hammering down so hard I couldn't even hear my own footsteps. I woke up to the back door creaking. I lay there, barely breathing, ears straining to hear past the rain, trying to convince myself it was just the wind. But I knew how stiff that door was. You had to shove it to get it open. The rain covered almost everything, but underneath it, I could hear faint, deliberate footsteps moving through the caravan. Slow, careful, like they were trying not to disturb anything. There was no way they'd forced the lock. I'd have heard it, even with the rain, which meant they already had a way in. I didn't know whether to move or stay still. My mind was racing through every bad decision I'd made. The unlocked window, the time I left the door open while I was cutting the grass, all the little moments someone could have slipped inside and left something wedged in the frame. The footsteps moved past the kitchen and into the living area, just a thin wall away from where I was lying. That's when it hit me. They weren't looking for valuables. They already knew I was there. I grabbed my phone, shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. No signal. Of course. Out there, you were lucky to get a single bar on a clear day, never mind in the middle of a storm. The footsteps stopped just outside the bedroom door. I sat up, every muscle tense, waiting for the handle to move. But nothing happened. I waited there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, until I couldn't hear anything but the rain. When I finally worked up the nerve to check, the mobile home was empty. The back door was wide open, rain pooling on the floor. But whoever had been inside was gone. I left the next morning. I never found out who they were, or how long they'd been watching the place before I even noticed. But sometimes, when it rains hard enough, I still catch myself listening for footsteps beneath the noise, wondering how close they might have been, and how much worse it could have been if I hadn't woken up when I did. This happened in 2021, not long after I moved into a new build estate just outside town. It was one of those developments where only half the houses were finished when people started moving in. My row was done, but 2 streets over, it was still a building site. Scaffolding up, diggers parked on muddy plots, all that. The builders were everywhere during the day. Vans coming and going, blokes in high-vis walking straight across people's gardens like they owned the place. It was annoying, but no one said much about it. You just sort of accept it when you move into a half-finished estate. I was living alone at the time. The house was small, just 2 bedrooms, barely any furniture because I'd spent everything on the deposit. It was the first place that was properly mine, and even though it didn't feel homely yet, I liked it. The first weird thing I noticed was the side gate. I'd only been there a couple of weeks when I found it unlatched one afternoon. I wasn't in the habit of using the side gate yet. The bins were at the front, so I knew I hadn't left it open. I figured it was the wind, or maybe one of the builders cutting through, and I didn't think much of it. But then, a few days later, I came home from work and found the back door unlocked. That one gave me pause. I was sure I'd locked it that morning, but I also knew I was still getting used to living there. Maybe I'd just forgotten. It's easy to second-guess yourself in a new routine. That same evening, I was in the kitchen making tea when I saw someone walk past the window. Not on the street, inside the garden. He was wearing work boots and a dusty jacket, just strolling past like he was meant to be there. By the time I got to the back door, he was already heading through the gap in the fence onto the unfinished plots behind my garden. I told myself he was just taking a shortcut, maybe checking the boundary or something. The builders were always cutting corners, so it wasn't that strange. At least, that's what I convinced myself. It kept happening, though. Not every day, but enough that I noticed. The side gate unlatched again. The bins moved slightly. Once even the conservatory door left just off the latch. Nothing dramatic, nothing that screamed break-in, but little things that chipped away at my sense of security. The tipping point came one Friday evening. I'd finished work late, grabbed a chippy on the way home, and was sitting on the sofa, half watching the telly. It was dark by then, the streetlights barely reaching the back garden. I heard the gate open. Not loud, just a soft creak, like someone easing it open slowly, trying not to make noise. I muted the TV, heart thudding in my chest, and crept to the kitchen window. There was a man standing just inside the garden, half hidden behind the fence panel, looking up at the house. He wasn't wearing a high-vis this time, just a dark hoodie and the same dusty work boots I'd seen before. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, hands in his pockets, head slightly tilted like he was deciding something. I nearly opened the back door to ask what the hell he was doing, but something about the way he stood there made me stop. It wasn't the posture of someone checking something. He was too still, too patient. I waited until he moved off, back through the gap into the construction site, before I let myself breathe properly. The next day, I called the developer's office to complain. They said they'd look into it, told me contractors shouldn't be accessing gardens without permission, but they didn't seem particularly bothered. Another downside of buying on a new estate: you're just one in a long list of unfinished jobs. That night, I made sure everything was locked. Windows, doors, even the garage. I didn't want to give anyone an excuse. I went to bed around midnight. The house was silent apart from the faint hum of the boiler kicking in. At 2:43 a.m. I remember the exact time because I checked my phone. I woke up to the sound of footsteps on the stairs. Soft, slow footsteps. Not the confident stride of someone who belongs there. The careful, deliberate kind of movement you only make when you're trying not to be heard. I lay there, completely still, my brain racing through every possible explanation. None of them good. The stairs creaked again, this time closer to the top. The front door was still locked. I knew it was, because I'd checked it twice, which meant they'd already been inside when I locked up. I don't remember getting out of bed or grabbing my phone, but somehow I ended up in the bathroom, door locked, sitting on the floor with my back against the wall. The footsteps didn't stop. They just moved slowly down the landing, past my bedroom, past the bathroom door, heading towards the spare room. Then, nothing. No door opening, no retreating footsteps. Just silence. I sat there for at least an hour before I opened the door, phone clutched so tightly my fingers ached. The house was empty. The front door still locked. The windows all shut. But the side gate, the one I'd locked from the inside, was wide open. The police came, had a look around, took my statement. They said it was probably one of the workers trying his luck, seeing if the new builds were easy targets. Nothing had been taken, so they left it at that. The developer quietly fitted new locks on the side gates after that. I never found out how long he'd been in the house before I woke up, or how many times he'd let himself in without me ever noticing. This happened back in 2020, during that weird stretch of time when I was working from home and hardly saw anyone except for food deliveries. I'd just moved into this detached place on the edge of the village. Big garden, loads of space. Exactly what I thought I wanted, after years in a cramped flat. The garden was the main selling point. It was huge, stretching way back, with a bit of overgrown woodland at the far end. It felt private, cut off, which seemed ideal at first. That sense of privacy didn't last long. The first time I noticed something was off was maybe 2 weeks after I moved in. I was sitting at the dining table, laptop open, and I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. Someone walking past the hedge at the bottom of the garden. It was quick, just a flash of a dark jacket. And by the time I stood up to get a proper look, whoever it was had already gone. I figured it was someone cutting through, maybe a dog walker who didn't realize it was private property. I didn't think much of it. Over the next few days, I started noticing odd little things. Nothing big, just subtle. The side gate left slightly open when I knew I'd shut it. A muddy footprint near the shed that didn't match my shoes. A faint scrape along the outside of the conservatory glass, like something had been dragged across it. Each time, I shrugged it off. New house, new routines. I assumed I was just being paranoid, second-guessing myself because everything still felt unfamiliar. But then, there was the cigarette. I don't smoke. No one I knew had been over yet, and it wasn't just any cigarette butt. It was fresh, the paper still slightly damp from the rain the night before, left right in the middle of the garden path. That was the first moment where I couldn't just dismiss it. Someone had been standing there, in the middle of my garden, smoking. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a workman from next door, or a local kid messing about. But none of it made sense. No one had any reason to be back there, and the more I thought about it, the less I liked the fact I hadn't noticed. Someone had been watching the house, watching me. That night, I locked everything, doors, windows, even the garage, and left the kitchen light on, hoping it would be enough of a deterrent. For a few days, nothing happened. No footprints, no noises, nothing left behind. I started convincing myself I'd overreacted, let my imagination run wild because I was living on my own for the first time. But then, around 11:30 one night, I was watching TV when I heard a sound. It was quiet, but deliberate. A light tap against the living room window. Not a knock, not something caught in the wind. A single, deliberate tap. I froze. The curtains were shut, and for a second, I sat there, half expecting to hear it again, but nothing came. I told myself it was a branch, or maybe a bird, even though I knew neither made sense at that time of night. I turned the volume up and forced myself to forget about it. The next day, I found something else. The garden furniture, a little table and 2 chairs I hadn't even used yet, had been moved. It was subtle, but I noticed immediately. The chairs were angled differently, one pushed slightly back like someone had been sitting there, facing the house. That was the moment I realized whoever it was hadn't just been passing through. They'd been sitting there, watching the house for who knows how long. I checked every window, every door, pacing the house trying to convince myself it was nothing. But the thing that stuck with me, the thing I still can't explain, was the muddy footprint on the windowsill outside the living room. The footprint was facing in, like someone had stood there, pressed right up against the glass, looking inside. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the house felt too loud, every shadow too long. I kept telling myself it was probably some bored kid, or someone checking empty properties to see if they were up for sale. Harmless stuff. But I didn't believe it. The next evening, I set up my laptop at the dining table again, trying to act normal. I deliberately left the curtains open, partly to prove to myself I wasn't scared, partly because I wanted to see if anything happened. It was just after 10 when I saw him. He was standing at the very edge of the garden, half hidden behind the hedge. I couldn't make out his face, just the outline, broad-shouldered, dark jacket, standing completely still. We stood there, watching each other, me through the window, him through the gaps in the hedge. Then he turned and walked back into the trees. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat in the dark, every light off, listening for any sound of footsteps outside. I didn't hear anything, but that didn't make me feel any better. The next morning, I found the side gate open again, not swinging wide, just slightly ajar, like someone had passed through carefully, not wanting to make noise. That was the last time I saw him, but I have no idea how many times he saw me. The police couldn't do much. No crime had technically been committed, and by the time they came out, the rain had wiped away any prints. They said it was probably a local or someone from the construction site further up the lane, curious about the new house. But I know better. You don't stand in someone's garden for days, moving their furniture, leaving footprints right up against the glass, unless you're planning something. And the worst part is, he never had to break in. Because the whole time I was locking doors and checking windows, I never thought to check the loft hatch in the garage. It was slightly open the day I moved out. I still don't know if that was how he got in, but I'm not sure I want to. This happened in late 2022. I remember because it was around that weird post-Christmas stretch where you've lost track of days but work's starting up again. I was still working from home then. Proper home office set up in the spare room, desk tucked against the window, laptop docked, the whole thing. The house itself was nothing fancy, just a mid-terrace on a quiet street, decent neighbours, no real issues. I'd lived there for about 3 years at that point, and if you'd asked me back then, I would have said I felt completely safe. That night was normal. I'd worked late, trying to clear some backlog, so I wouldn't be buried the first proper week back. Around 11, I decided to stick on some music while I finished off a few emails. Not too loud, just enough to drown out the creaks and hums of an old house settling. I do that a lot. Headphones on, screen glare the only light in the room, completely tuned out from everything else. I think about that now, and it makes me feel sick. I was halfway through typing when I felt something. Not heard, felt. It's hard to explain, but you know that change in the air when someone walks into a room, the shift in pressure, the subtle change in temperature. It was like that. I froze for a second, fingers hovering over the keyboard, then took the headphones off. The house was silent. That was the first moment I second-guessed myself. Maybe I'd imagined it. Sitting too long in front of a screen, brain playing tricks. But then I noticed the draft. The office door was open a crack. I always shut it when I'm working, partly out of habit, partly because it helps keep the heat in. I was certain I'd closed it. I got up, opened it fully, and peered down the hallway. Everything looked normal. Dark, quiet, the front door still bolted. I was about to brush it off when I saw it. The back door, at the far end of the hall, was open. Not wide, just slightly ajar, enough that the cold air was seeping in, making the floor cold under my feet. I stood there for a few seconds, trying to process it. I knew I'd locked that door. I always double-check before I go upstairs, even if I'm only popping down for a drink. I told myself maybe I hadn't pulled it fully shut, that the wind had nudged it open. That seemed reasonable, except the security chain was hanging loose. You can't just forget to latch a chain. My first instinct was to check every room, even though the rational part of me was screaming that if someone had come in, they'd have bolted the second they realized I was home. But the house was empty. No muddy footprints, nothing out of place. I told myself I'd overreacted. Maybe the lock hadn't caught properly. Maybe the chain had slipped when I opened it earlier. The brain's brilliant at handing you excuses when you really want them. I shut the door, locked it again, even wedged a chair under the handle, just to feel a bit better. Then I went back to the office, telling myself I was being paranoid. That lasted about 10 minutes. I'd just sat back down, headphones off this time, when I heard it. The softest creak from the landing. Not loud, just weight shifting on an old floorboard. I felt that same change in the air, like I wasn't alone. I didn't move straight away, partly because I was trying not to make noise, but mostly because my brain was still desperate to believe I was imagining it. But then the creak came again, closer this time. I stood up slowly, listening so hard my ears hurt. and edged towards the door. I could just see the top of the stairs. Nothing there. I should have turned the light on straight away, but I didn't. I stood there in the dark, staring into the landing, heart hammering so hard I felt dizzy. There was no sound, no movement. I convinced myself the house was just settling, that the heating pipes were cooling, all the usual rubbish you tell yourself when you don't want to admit you're scared in your own home. Then I saw the shadow. It was faint, just the outline of someone standing perfectly still at the bottom of the stairs, only visible because the streetlight outside was throwing a faint glow through the glass. They weren't moving. They weren't trying to hide. They were just standing there, facing up towards me, like they were waiting for me to come down. I didn't. I backed into the office, locked the door, and called the police. My voice was shaking so badly they could barely understand me. When they arrived, the back door was still locked. The chain was still in place. There was no sign anyone had broken in. They checked the house, front to back, even the garden, but they didn't find anything. No muddy prints, no signs of forced entry. Nothing. They left after about an hour, told me it was probably nothing. A shadow. A trick of the light. I wanted to believe them. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my desk until the sun came up, every light in the house on, waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did. I still don't know how they got in, whether they forced the lock and somehow re-locked it after, or if they'd been inside before I locked up. But the thought that gets to me the most is this. They were standing there, watching me, while I was sitting with my headphones on. They could have been inches away, and I wouldn't have known. And I have no idea how long they were there before I finally took the headphones off. This happened when I was renting a loft apartment in a converted warehouse just outside Manchester. It was one of those places they call industrial chic. Exposed brick walls, massive windows, steel beams running across the ceiling. Looked great in photos, but in reality, it was drafty as hell, and you could hear every noise from the flats around you. The building itself was old, but it had been modernized, which mostly meant keycard access at the front door and a couple of CCTV cameras stuck to the walls. It felt secure enough. That sense of safety was probably my biggest mistake. The first time something felt off was about 2 months after I moved in. I'd just finished work. I was still fully remote back then and was making something to eat when I heard footsteps above me. That shouldn't have been possible. I was on the top floor. Above my ceiling was nothing but the roof. At first, I convinced myself I was hearing something from one of the other flats, maybe someone in the stairwell or on the fire escape. The sound was faint enough that I managed to brush it off, but I kept hearing it. Not every night, but often enough that I started noticing a pattern, usually around midnight. Always slow, deliberate steps, never running, never talking, just this soft, uneven tread moving back and forth, right above my ceiling. I even asked the building manager about it once. He said there was an old maintenance walkway up there, a narrow crawl space under the roof, used for wiring and pipes, but no one should have been up there. The contractors hadn't been in for weeks. I told myself it was probably just the building settling. Then, about a week later, I found something. It was a single boot print, smudged into the dust near the corner of my bedroom ceiling, where the exposed brick met the old ventilation shaft. At first, I thought maybe it was old, left by a builder during the renovation, but it was too sharp, too fresh. There was even a little streak where someone had slipped slightly. That was the first time I felt properly uneasy. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a maintenance guy had popped up there without logging it. But I still found myself checking the ceilings more often after that, looking for gaps or loose panels. A couple of nights later, I woke up to a sound I couldn't immediately place. Not footsteps this time, something lighter, like the soft scrape of fabric against metal. I lay there, heart thudding, staring up at the ceiling, and then I heard it again. The ventilation shaft cover, a square metal plate about halfway along the ceiling, gave this faint metallic creak. I sat up, reaching for my phone torch, and for a split second, I saw it. The cover was slightly ajar, only by a few millimeters, but enough to see the darkness beyond it, enough to see the edge of something pale, fingers or a sleeve, pulling back into the void the moment the light hit it. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next day, I convinced myself I'd imagined it. Sleep deprivation does weird things, right? I even Googled things like hypnagogic hallucinations, looking for something to explain it. That evening, I bolted the front door, checked every window, and settled on the sofa with the TV on. Loud. Around midnight, there was a knock at the door. Not the front door, the maintenance access door at the end of the hallway, the one that led to the roof crawl space. I froze, volume still blasting, just staring down the hall. There shouldn't have been anyone on the other side of that door. It was only supposed to be accessible from the outside, through a locked maintenance stairwell. Residents didn't have keys. The knock came again, softer this time. I don't know how long I stood there, just staring at the door, willing it not to happen again. Eventually, it went quiet. I told myself it was the wind. The next morning, I called the building manager again. He came up with a contractor to check the maintenance door, and that's when they found it. The lock had been tampered with. Nothing obvious, no damage, no forced entry. But someone had carefully loosened the plate so it could be opened from either side. There was a narrow ledge behind it, just wide enough for someone to stand on, overlooking the hallway. The contractor said the tampering wasn't new. Someone had been using that space for a while. I didn't stay much longer after that. The official explanation was that it was probably a squatter, someone who'd been accessing the crawl spaces through an external hatch and using empty sections of the building to sleep in. But I know they were in my flat at least once, because when I packed up to leave, I found something tucked behind the fridge, a single empty water bottle, slightly crushed, with a brand I'd never bought. Whoever it was, they didn't just watch me from above. At some point, they'd stood in my kitchen, drinking their water, and left without me ever knowing. This happened in 2022, during one of those off-season breaks, where you can get a decent holiday rental for next to nothing. My girlfriend had found this place, a converted cottage on the edge of some village in North Wales. It was one of those properties that looked too nice in the photos, but the price was decent, and the reviews were fine. We drove up on a Friday afternoon. The place was about as remote as you'd expect. A long gravel driveway, nothing but hedgerows and empty fields around it. One neighbour visible through the trees, but otherwise completely on its own. The key was in one of those lockboxes by the door. Straightforward enough. Except the code the owner had sent didn't work. We stood there for about 5 minutes, trying different combinations, until my girlfriend finally rang the owner. While she was on the phone, I noticed something. The curtain in the upstairs window moved, just a little, like someone had pulled it back slightly to see who was outside. At first, I thought maybe it was the cleaner finishing up, or someone from the agency doing a final check. It's not that weird, right? The owner eventually gave us a backup code. The box opened, and we got in. The place was clean enough, bit dated, but fine. Cozy, if anything. The kind of cottage that smells faintly of damp no matter how much you air it out. I couldn't stop thinking about the curtain, though. We carried our bags in, checked out the rooms, the usual. But the whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house felt occupied. Not in a haunted way or anything like that. Just like someone had been living there very recently. There was an empty mug on the kitchen counter, tea stains still in the bottom. The sofa cushions were slightly indented, like someone had been sitting there for a long time. The main bedroom window was open a crack, even though it was cold outside. My girlfriend didn't notice, and I didn't mention it. That night, we made dinner, had a couple of drinks, and settled in to watch something. I was starting to relax by then. I figured maybe the cleaner had been rushed, left in a hurry. Nothing sinister. But then, around 11 p.m., I heard the stairs creak. It wasn't loud, just one of those old house noises, but it sounded deliberate, like weight shifting, not wood settling. I muted the TV. My girlfriend had dozed off, so I just sat there, waiting to hear it again. Nothing. I told myself it was probably the heating or a draft, even though the heating wasn't on and the windows were all shut. That was the first night. The second day was normal enough, though I kept noticing small things. The back door was unlocked in the morning, even though I was sure I'd locked it before bed. A faint smell of smoke in the upstairs bathroom. Old, stale, like someone had been smoking out the window weeks ago. The second night is when it got bad. We went to bed around midnight. The house was silent, just the occasional crack of the old timbers shifting. I woke up at some point in the night. No reason, just one of those sudden wide-awake moments. I lay there for a second, trying to work out what had disturbed me, when I heard it. Breathing. It wasn't loud, not dramatic, horror film breathing, just the faint, slow sound of someone inhaling and exhaling, somewhere near the foot of the bed. I sat up fast, fumbling for my phone torch. The room was empty. I told myself I'd imagined it, that I'd woken from some half-dream where the sound carried over. But I still lay awake for hours after, heart racing, straining to hear anything else. It was just after 5 a.m. when I heard the front door shut. Not slam, not bang, just the soft, careful click of a door being closed by someone who doesn't want to be heard. I woke my girlfriend, told her I thought someone was in the house. She was groggy, didn't fully register it until we went downstairs together. The door was locked, the chain was on. Everything looked exactly as we'd left it, except, and I still don't know how I missed it the night before, there was a sleeping bag tucked into the corner of the living room. It was old and filthy, but it had clearly been used recently. Next to it was an empty packet of cigarettes, the same brand I'd smelled upstairs. We called the owner immediately. That's when they admitted there'd been a situation with the previous tenant. They hadn't been renting through the usual sites. This guy had been living there unofficially for months, paying cash, until they finally evicted him a couple of weeks before we arrived. They swore they'd changed the locks, but they must have missed something. The police came, took a statement, checked the house. They didn't find anyone, but they did find a loose window catch in the upstairs bedroom, one that could be opened easily from the outside if you knew exactly how. The theory was he'd been slipping in at night, using the house like he still lived there, watching us until we went to bed, then letting himself out before morning. There was no sign of forced entry, no threats, no confrontation, but that's what makes it worse somehow. Knowing he was there the whole time, hiding just out of sight, waiting for us to fall asleep. We left that morning. I still check under every bed and behind every door whenever I stay somewhere new. Not because I believe in ghosts, because you can't always be sure the last person ever really left. This happened in 2019, when I was renting a house just outside Bristol. It was one of those modern places, big open plan downstairs, loads of natural light, and massive windows, floor to ceiling in the living room, and smaller ones lining the hallway and kitchen. It looked great during the day, but at night, especially when the garden lights were off, all you could see in those windows was your own reflection. It felt safe enough, though. The area was quiet, mostly families, and the back garden was fenced off with one of those tall, solid panels you can't see through. I liked the space, even if it felt a bit exposed sometimes. The first time I noticed something was off, I didn't even clock it as weird at first. It was a Wednesday night, around 10 p.m. I'd just finished washing up and went into the living room to put some rubbish in the bin. That's when I noticed it, a smudge, right in the middle of the glass, at about head height. It looked like someone had put their hand on the outside of the window, fingers splayed, then dragged it down slightly. At first, I assumed it was me, maybe from earlier, when I'd opened the patio door. But the angle was all wrong, too high, too neat. I wiped it off, didn't think much of it. A few nights later it happened again. Same spot, same faint handprint, like someone had been leaning against the glass, looking in. This time, I stood there for a minute, staring out into the dark garden, trying to make sense of it. There was no sign anyone had been there. The garden gate was shut. The fence was tall enough that no one could just lean over. I told myself it must have been condensation, or something I'd touched earlier, and left it at that. But once I'd noticed it, I couldn't stop seeing it. Every couple of nights, there'd be some mark on the glass. A faint handprint, a smudge where someone might have pressed their face, even a streak across the lower part of the window like something had been dragged along it. It was always subtle, and it always felt like I could explain it if I really tried, but it was happening too often to ignore. One night, I deliberately left the garden light on, thinking maybe it was foxes or something brushing up against the glass. But just after midnight, I woke up. No noise, no reason, and went downstairs to get a drink. The garden light was off, not flickering, not broken, just switched off at the wall. The switch was inside the house. That's when the unease really started to settle in. I spent the next day trying to convince myself it was all some weird series of coincidences. I was forgetting things, imagining patterns where there weren't any. It was easier than thinking about the alternative. That night, I made sure everything was locked. Windows, doors, even the latch on the side gate. I left a couple of lamps on too, just for peace of mind. At around 11 p.m, I was sitting on the sofa watching something when I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. Something just outside the window. I turned, heart already racing, but there was nothing there, just my own reflection staring back at me. I told myself it was just my imagination, the light from the TV catching the glass in a weird way. I forced myself to keep watching, trying not to look at the windows. But about 10 minutes later, I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping. Not loud, not desperate, just the kind of tap you'd do if you were trying to get someone's attention without alarming them. It was coming from the kitchen window. I stood up slowly, every part of me screaming not to, and walked into the kitchen. The window was shut, but there was a fresh handprint on the glass, this time right at eye level. fingers spread wide. There was no one there. I tried to tell myself it was old, that I just hadn't noticed it earlier. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I checked every door and window again, even though I knew they were locked. Then I sat back down, phone in hand, just waiting. It was about half an hour later when I heard the side gate creak. Not loudly, just a slow, deliberate scrape of wood against metal, like someone was opening it inch by inch to avoid making noise. I should have called the police then, but part of me still didn't want to believe it was happening, like if I just stayed quiet, whoever it was would get bored and leave. The house stayed silent for another hour, and eventually I convinced myself I was imagining the whole thing. I went to bed just after 1 a.m. At 3:17 a.m., I woke up to the sound of the back door unlocking. It was the slowest, softest sound, the deliberate click of a key turning, followed by the faintest creak as the door was pushed open. I didn't move. I lay there, holding my breath, straining to hear past the blood pounding in my ears. Footsteps, slow, careful ones, crossed the living room. They stopped at the bottom of the stairs. I couldn't see them from where I was, but I could feel them standing there, just listening. I don't know how long they stood there, but eventually, the footsteps moved again, back through the house, out the back door, which clicked shut behind them. The next morning, I found the spare key missing from the hook near the door. The estate agent swore they'd collected all copies when I moved in, but I guess whoever it was either had a copy or had taken it from somewhere. I changed the locks that day. The police couldn't do much. No sign of forced entry, no fingerprints on the windows. Just my own vague account of noises and handprints they couldn't prove were anything. I stayed in that house for another 6 months, and nothing ever happened again. But I still think about it sometimes. The smudges on the glass, the feeling that someone was watching me every time I stood in front of those windows. And the part that sticks with me most is how long they must have been watching before they ever stepped inside.